You wake up, and the first smell that enters your nose is not bread, not smoke, not wet earth. It is shit. It is fermented urine. It is decomposition. And the most disturbing thing is not the smell itself. It is that you no longer notice it. Your nose learned to ignore it. Your brain registers and discards. You were born inside this smell. You grew up inside it. You will die inside it. And at no point in your life will anyone tell you there is another way to live. Because there isn't. Not here. Not in 900 AD in England. Not for you. Before you understand what sewage is in this world, you need to understand what the body is in this world. Because today, when you think about sanitation, you think about plumbing. You think about an invisible chain of pipes that carries what you don't want to see to a place you will never visit. The problem disappears with a flush. Simple, invisible, solved. Here, none of that exists. Here, the problem does not disappear. It stays. It accumulates. It ferments on the same floor where you sleep, where your children crawl, where your food is prepared. And the most cruel thing is not the filth itself. It is that you have no mental tools to connect that filth to the death it causes. You will watch children die without ever knowing why. You will bury neighbors without understanding what killed them. You will survive a fever that left you prostrate for weeks, and thank God without imagining that it was the water from the stream behind your house that almost took you. This is the world you inhabit. A world where the most constant danger of your life is beneath your feet, on your hands, in your mouth, and is completely invisible to you. Let's start from the beginning, the real beginning, from the body. You need to urinate. You need to defecate. Every day, multiple times. That is a biological fact that no social structure, no religious belief, and no political system can erase. Your body produces waste. It always has. It always will. The question that defines entire civilizations is not whether the body produces waste. It is where that waste ends up. And in 900 AD in England, the answer is brutally simple. It ends up wherever is convenient. Outside the door, in the corner of the field, in the nearest river, in the ditch beside the road, in the hole you dig when you remember to dig one, and when there is no hole in the place where you are. Because convenience governs everything when there is no infrastructure. And infrastructure is a word that does not exist in anyone's vocabulary in this world. Your house is small, much smaller than anything you can imagine. 1 or 2 rooms at most, walls of wood and clay, thatched roof, compacted earth floor. There is no bathroom. There is no separate room for bodily functions. There is nothing that serves that purpose in a deliberate and permanent way. What exists is an informal practice, varied, inconsistent, that changes from family to family and from season to season. In summer, you go out to the field, far enough that the smell does not come through the door, close enough not to waste time. In winter, that changes. When the temperature drops, when snow blocks the paths, when going outside at 3 in the morning means freezing, you improvise. A bucket, a wooden bowl, a corner of the house surrounded by rags, not because you are careless, not because you do not care, but because surviving the cold is more urgent than maintaining distance from your own waste. It always has been. It always will be while winter lasts. But you are not alone in this house. You are with your wife, your children, perhaps your elderly parents, perhaps a brother with no land of his own. 5, 6, 7 people in a space that today you would use as a storage room. And in winter there are more. The animals come in. The pig you raised all year, the chickens, sometimes a cow or a goat if the winter is severe enough to threaten their lives, because the animals have value. A pig dead from cold is food you will not have. A dead cow is labor you have lost. So they come in. And they also urinate. And they also defecate. And nobody is separating human waste from animal waste, because in this world there is no practical reason to do so. Everything goes to the same place. Everything mixes, everything ferments together on the floor where you sleep. This is not a dramatic exaggeration to shock you. It is documented. Archaeologists who excavated Anglo-Saxon rural settlements from the 10th century found clear evidence of humans and animals sharing the same space. The organic residues incorporated into the floors of medieval dwellings tell a story that no written text of the period bothered to record, because for those who lived like this, it was not extraordinary. It was normal. It was simply how things were, and the floor absorbs all of it. Literally, the compacted earth floor of your house is a historical sponge. Every spill, every leak, every child's urine that didn't make it outside in time, every animal defecation, all of it penetrates that earth. If someone were to excavate your house's floor centuries later, they would find layers of organic residue, preserved parasites, worm eggs, traces of bacteria. The floor where you eat, the floor where you sleep, the floor where your child learns to walk, all mixed with the biological history of your family. Now leave your house, go to the village. You are not alone in this problem. Every house in this village has the same problem as yours. Every family produces waste. Every family solves it the way they can. And when you add all of that together, when you imagine 30, 40, 50 houses within a small radius, with animals, with children, with adults, all solving the same biological need in the same improvised way, the result is an environment that today would cause immediate evacuation by sanitary authorities. Streets that are not streets. They are dirt paths that accumulate mud, manure, human waste and rainwater in a mixture that has no adequate name in modern English. You walk through this every day. Your children play in this every day. You carry it inside the house on the soles of your feet every day. The animals circulate freely. Chickens walk across the same space where children sit. Pigs rummage through what has been discarded. Dogs eat what the pigs left behind. And all of them defecate wherever they are when the need arrives. There is no enclosure, no separation, no protocol. There is chaotic coexistence between species in a space too small to contain all of this safely. And from this coexistence, from this constant mixing, disease emerges. Parasites emerge. The death you will never be able to explain emerges. But there is something you believe is helping. Manure. For you, animal waste is not just a problem. It is a resource. The manure from your animals goes to the fields. It fertilizes the soil. It helps the harvest grow. And this is real. This works. Medieval agriculture depended on animal manure as fertilizer, the same way modern agriculture depends on chemical fertilizers. The difference is that the process was completely manual, completely uncontrolled, and completely mixed with everything else. The manure that goes to the field passed through the same space where you store your food. The hands that spread the manure in the field are the same hands that prepare the bread, without washing between one thing and the other. Not because you are negligent, but because there is no connection in your mind between what is on your hands and what will make you sick. That connection will not be made until centuries later. You will die before anyone discovers it. Now let's talk about water, because everything described so far finds the water, and the water finds you. The stream that passes near your village has multiple uses. You drink from it. You wash clothes in it. You wash what needs washing in it. Your animals drink from it. And upstream, or sometimes on the same bank, the village's waste flows into it. Rain washes what is on the ground and carries it to the stream. The improvised sewage from the houses, where there is sufficient slope, drains into the stream. The animals defecate on the bank, and the next rain does the rest. And you go to that stream the next day and drink the same water that received all of this yesterday. Wells are different, but no better. A well is a column of earth dug until it finds the water table, and the water table receives what the earth absorbs. What the earth absorbs is everything that was discarded on the surface during months, years, decades. The shallow wells that most Anglo-Saxon villages used in the 10th century were constantly subject to contamination by percolation. The water looks clean. Sometimes it has a slightly different taste, slightly bitter, slightly metallic. You attribute this to the soil, to the season, to the weather. Never to contamination. You don't have that word. You don't have that concept. There is a specific time of year that is the most dangerous. Not winter, when the cold makes everything harder. It is spring, when the ice melts, when the rains come, when the soil that spent the winter frozen and accumulating everything begins to release what it stored. The meltwater carries with it months of compressed residue. The streams overflow. The wells turn murky. And the diseases that seem dormant in winter explode in spring as if they had been waiting for the right moment. Dysentery epidemics have seasonal patterns. The documents that survived from the medieval period, monastic chronicles, monastery records, bishops' reports, consistently mention outbreaks of gastrointestinal diseases in spring and early summer. Nobody connects this to the thaw. Nobody connects this to the water. God is testing the faith of the people. Penance is the answer. Boiled water never is. But you are not alone in this problem, because even those who have more than you face versions of the same nightmare. Let's visit the Lord, not metaphorically, literally. Let's enter his hall, his great room, his structure that is large compared to your house, but that by standards that will one day exist would be considered primitive. The lord of the land, the Anglo-Saxon Thane of the 10th century, has more space, more resources, more people working for him. That means his sanitation problem is larger, not smaller. More mouths, more bodies, more waste. And the solution they find is a more organized variation of what you do, but fundamentally the same principle. The Lord's Hall has pits, holes dug at specific locations, away from the main structures where waste is deposited. This seems more advanced, and in some ways it is. There is a deliberate intention to separate waste from the inhabited space, but there are problems that intention does not solve. The pit fills. When full, it is covered, and a new one is dug. The location of the old pit ferments, releases gases, contaminates the surrounding soil. During the rainy season, it overflows. During the dry season, the smell intensifies, and if the pit was dug near a well, which happened with disturbing frequency because nobody could calculate underground contamination lines, the water everyone drinks becomes compromised. Archaeologists who excavated Anglo-Saxon high-status settlement sites found something revealing. Wells and sanitation pits frequently coexisted at distances that any sanitary engineer today would immediately reject. Not out of complete ignorance, but out of lack of knowledge about how contamination moves through soil. The earth seems like a barrier. It seems to separate, in reality it conducts. And the water from a well dug 10 meters from a sanitation pit can be as contaminated as if they were the same hole. Now think about the monastery. If there is any place in England in 900 AD that comes close to an organized sanitation system, it is the monastery. Not because the monks were more aware of biological danger, but because monastic life demands organization. It demands routine. It demands that multiple people in an enclosed space coexist functionally over decades, and that practical need generated practical solutions. The Benedictine monasteries, which were the dominant model in Anglo-Saxon England of the period, followed the rule of Saint Benedict. That rule does not speak of sanitation with the vocabulary we would use today, but it creates structures that have sanitary consequences. The need for running water for daily ablutions, for washing hands before meals, for cleaning the dormitory, led monasteries to seek locations with access to rivers or springs. And where there was a river, there was the possibility of creating flow, and flow changes everything. Monastic latrines, called in Latin texts necessarium or reridorta, were deliberately constructed structures. A long corridor, sometimes with multiple seats, positioned over a channel of running water, or over a pit that was periodically flushed by diverting a stream. This is not a modern pipe. This is not a flush toilet. But it is an attempt to use physics, to use gravity and water flow, to move waste away from the inhabited space. It is a huge conceptual leap compared to what exists in the village where you live. But even the monastery does not escape completely. The channel that receives monastic waste goes where? To the same river that the villagers use downstream, the same river where the village's sewage has already arrived. The social hierarchy of medieval England is clear on many things. In water contamination, it levels out. The effluent from the cleanest monastery in the region ends up in the same stream as the sewage from the most miserable serf. Water does not respect status, and the monks themselves fall ill. Monastic chronicles record regular outbreaks of intestinal diseases within the convent walls. The monks who lived supposedly with more hygiene than anyone else in medieval England still succumbed to dysentery, still died of intestinal fevers, still fell victim to the parasites that inhabited the water and soil around them. This deeply disturbed the monks themselves, men who lived in obedience, in prayer, in penance, men who followed the rule. Why did God afflict them so? The answer they found was always theological, never sanitary. Humility needed to be tested. The body needed to be mortified. Illness was a disguised grace. It was never the pit that was 15 meters from the well. This is not a criticism of the monk's intelligence. It is observation about the limits of available knowledge. You cannot apply a solution to a problem you do not know exists. The concept of pathogen, of microorganism, of fecal-oral contamination is a concept of the 19th century. Pasteur has not yet been born. Koch has not yet been born. The idea that creatures invisible to the naked eye cause deadly diseases is almost 1,000 years away from being formulated scientifically. Nobody, not the most intelligent monk at Canterbury, not the most experienced Arab physician, not the most sophisticated philosopher of the time, has access to this knowledge. They do what they can with what they have, and what they have is observation without mechanism. They know that certain situations precede certain diseases. They know that accumulation of waste produces bad smell. They know that bad smell seems to correlate with disease, but the theory that exists to explain this is the miasmatic theory. The idea that putrid air, the miasma, is the vector of disease, not the water, not fecal-oral contact, the air. And that theory, wrong in its mechanisms but intuitively derived from real observation, produces solutions that sometimes help and sometimes change nothing. Throwing aromatic herbs on the floor to mask the smell, burning scented wood, praying in elevated places where the air seems purer. None of this eliminates the pathogen. But some of these practices, accidentally, reduce contact with contaminated surfaces. And that, without anyone understanding why, saves some lives. Now let's go to the city, because in 900 AD there are urban centers in England, not cities in the sense you know today, but concentrations of people dense enough to create a sanitation problem categorically different from what exists in the village. Winchester, York, London. These are the largest urban concentrations in Anglo-Saxon England in the late 10th century. Winchester was the de facto capital of the Kingdom of Wessex, the centre of power of Alfred and his successors. York was the great commercial centre of the north, still carrying the heritage of the Viking occupation that had transformed it into Jorvik. London was London, even at this time an agglomeration that already surpassed in density everything else on the island. In Winchester, the Roman structure still exists physically. The walls are standing. Some of the streets follow the Roman grid, and in some locations, fragments of the Roman drainage system still function, partially accidentally, without anyone deliberately maintaining them. When archaeologists excavated the subsoil of Winchester, they found stratigraphic sequences that tell a fascinating and nauseating story at the same time. Below the Anglo-Saxon layers, there are Roman layers with evidence of organized drainage. On top, the layers from the 10th century show this system progressively collapsing, being blocked, ignored, replaced by improvised solutions. It is possible, literally, to excavate the moment when the technical memory was lost. Because the problem is not that the Anglo-Saxons were primitive. The problem is that they inherited ruins of a system they never fully understood. The Romans built sewers, aqueducts, public bathrooms, drainage systems integrated into the urban structure, and then they left. And the knowledge of how to build, maintain, and operate these systems left with them, or at least fragmented so much that it was no longer operationally useful. What remained were the stones, the holes in the stones, the trenches in the earth, but not the knowledge of how to make all of it work together. In York, the Viking heritage adds another layer to the problem. The Scandinavians who established Jorvik in the 9th century did not bring with them a tradition of urban sanitation. They brought craftsmanship, trade, nautical skill. The Coppergate excavations in York in the 1970s are perhaps the most vivid archaeological record of what urban life was like in this period. And what they revealed about sanitation is extraordinary in its brutality. The latrines of Jorvik were holes dug in the backyards of houses, multiple holes per yard, sometimes side by side. When one was exhausted, another was dug, and the parasites found in those latrines, preserved in the anaerobic soil for 1,000 years, tell the complete story. Ascaris, Trichuris, Capillaria, intestinal worms that today are associated with conditions of extreme poverty in regions without basic sanitation, present in virtually every hole excavated, present in the same quantity in high and low status structures. Wealth did not protect from parasites. Wealth only determined the size of the latrine, and between those latrines and the water wells in the same area, the distance was measured in meters, sometimes in centimeters. The residents of Jorvik in the 10th century carried a parasitic load that today would be considered a public health emergency. Not as an exception, as a permanent condition of life. Children were born with parasites inherited from their mother. They grew up acquiring more. The symptoms, the chronic fatigue, the digestive problems, the anemia, were so constant that they were probably not recognized as symptoms. This was how the body felt. This was how everyone felt. Therefore, it was normal. London, in this period, is smaller than you imagine. The great Roman city was largely abandoned, its internal structures disappearing under decades of vegetation and collapse. What exists in 900 AD is a city rebuilding itself, a settlement that grew outside the Roman walls and that is gradually reoccupying the space within. And that growth happens without planning, without zoning, without any consideration of sanitary infrastructure. Streets form where traffic creates paths. Houses are built where space is available. Sewage goes wherever it is convenient to throw it. The Thames, which today appears as a clean river navigating the heart of a modern city, was in the 10th century a receiver of everything. Domestic sewage, slaughterhouse waste, tannery discharges, animal excrement, organic garbage of every nature, and also the source of drinking water for a significant portion of the population. The bank of the Thames was simultaneously where you discarded and where you drank, and between the discarding and the drinking, there was no barrier. There were only a few meters of river. This was not complete ignorance. There was awareness that water near discharge was problematic. There were attempts, in some places and periods, to spatially separate water collection from waste disposal. But these attempts were localized, dependent on the goodwill of each inhabitant, without enforcement, without system. A family that discarded into the river above the neighbor's collection point was not committing a crime. There was no law that prohibited it. There was no concept that made this morally problematic. They were simply being convenient. And sometimes convenience killed entire neighborhoods. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with an epidemic that arrived and swept through in weeks. It killed slowly, incrementally, child by child, adult by adult, with diseases that seemed random because there was no way to identify the pattern. Dysentery that killed children in July, typhoid fever that took adults in September, intestinal infections that weakened the elderly until winter finished them off. The pattern was there. Contaminated water followed a schedule defined by hydrology and climate, but without the knowledge to read that pattern, it was invisible. It was the will of God. It was fate. It was the random cruelty of life. There is an aspect of this system, or this absence of system, that goes beyond the physical. That goes beyond contamination and parasites and disease, and it is the social aspect. Sewage in England in 900 AD is not just a matter of infrastructure. It is a matter of power. It is a matter of who has to deal with the problem and who can distance themselves from it. And this division is as clear as the division between serf and lord, between peasant and warrior. You, the serf, you live where you live because you have no choice. Your house is where the lord determined. Close to the fields you work, close to the other serfs who form the labor unit of the estate. Close, therefore, to the accumulation of waste from all that community. You cannot move to a place with better drainage. You cannot choose a house more distant from the most obvious contamination point. You are where you are, and where you are is where the sewage is also. The Lord has more space, has more capacity to create distance between his residence and the problems it generates. His hall can be positioned slightly above the surrounding terrain. His latrines can be built sufficiently away from the inhabited structures. This does not eliminate the problem, but it creates a gradient of exposure. The lord is less exposed than the serf, the thane less than the peasant, the bishop less than the thane, and at the top of this hierarchy, the king in his palace at Winchester or in any of the royal residences scattered across the kingdom. The king who has more servants to deal with the waste, more space to create distance, more resources to maintain a minimal level of sanitary organization. But even the king, in the 10th century in England, is not immune. The itinerant court, the model of government that has the king and his entire retinue moving continuously from one royal property to another, exists partly for political reasons, but also, some historians document, for practical reasons. A royal residence with hundreds of people, with the court's animals, with servants, warriors, courtiers, generates an amount of waste that the location simply cannot absorb indefinitely. When the waste accumulates too much, when the smell becomes unbearable, when diseases begin to appear, the court moves to the next property, and the abandoned property rests, decomposes, slowly cleans itself through the seasons, until it is ready to receive the court again. This is sanitation management. It is a form of sanitation management that does not recognize itself as such. But it is, and it works in a fashion for those who have that option. For the serf who cannot move, who stays in the same place while the waste accumulates, that option does not exist. You stay. The problem stays with you. There is something you use every day that carries this problem in a way you will never fully understand. It is your hands. Hands are the central vector of transmission in this world. Not the air, not the miasma, not contact with the sick. The hands. You work in the field with your hands. The field was fertilized with manure. Your hands touch the fertilized soil. You eat with the same hands. You prepare your children's food with the same hands. You care for a sick child with the same hands, and then prepare the healthy child's food with the same hands. The practice of washing hands before eating does not exist as a universal norm. There exists in monasteries an ablution before meals that has as much ritual as hygienic significance. There exists, among the more prosperous, the use of an aqua manile, water vessels for rinsing hands at the table. But for the overwhelming majority of the population, the idea that washing hands before eating is a biological necessity does not exist. It is not part of the culture. It is not taught. It is not practiced. And this absence of a practice as simple as washing hands kills more people than any war, any famine, any severe winter. It kills silently in a way that seems random, in a way that can never be attributed to its real cause. It kills children who were still healthy yesterday. It kills adults in the prime of their strength. It kills the elderly who survived decades of adversity only to succumb to an infection that entered through the mouth on a spring morning when the soil was still wet from the thaw. There is a cruel irony in all of this. The same substance that contaminates, the manure, the waste, is the substance that feeds. The dung that fertilizes the field is what makes possible the harvest that prevents famine. The relationship between survival and contamination is so intimate that they cannot be separated. To have food, you need the manure. To have the manure, you need the animals. To have the animals, you need the space that the animals share with you. And that shared space is the space that poisons you. You cannot eliminate the poison without eliminating survival. They are the same thing. This is the central trap of the world in which you live. It is not possible to escape from it with the available resources. It is not a matter of will, of intelligence, of effort. It is a matter of the knowledge necessary to solve the problem not yet existing. And it will take almost 1,000 years for it to exist. In the meantime, you survive as you can. You adapt your body to a load of pathogens and parasites that would be intolerable to a modern immune system. Your gut microbiota, the community of microorganisms in your intestine, is radically different from that of a 21st century person. Not necessarily worse in every aspect, but different. Adapted to an environment of constant exposure. Your immune system learns from birth to coexist with a pressure that has no parallel in the contemporary world. Some of these adaptations protect you. Some cost you energy you cannot spare. And when a new pathogen appears, one that your system has not yet encountered, the adaptation does not help. You become as vulnerable as any modern person. There is a specific smell that marks this world, not just the general smell of filth and decomposition. A more specific, more persistent smell that today we would immediately recognize as a sign of danger, but that here is simply the smell of daily life. It is the smell of organic matter decomposing under anaerobic conditions. It is the methane gas released by the pits. It is the hydrogen sulfide from the drainage ditches. It is the indole and scatole produced by fecal decomposition. Today, these compounds in high concentration are recognized as contamination indicators, as warning signs that activate extremely ancient aversion responses in the human nervous system. Here they are just the smell of home, the smell of the village, the smell of being alive in this world, and you get used to it. The human olfactory system has an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. Prolonged exposure to an olfactory stimulus results in desensitization. The smell that at first causes nausea becomes over time invisible. You no longer smell the sewage of your village. You no longer smell the residue accumulated on the floor of your house. Visitors from other villages may notice. Merchants who travel and have comparative reference may notice. But you who were born here, who grew up here, no longer notice. And this is both a protection and a danger. Protection because constant disgust would be psychologically unbearable. Danger because the smell was the only warning signal that could, at some level, motivate change. The text that survived from the Anglo-Saxon period rarely mentions sewage directly. This is not surprising. The people who write are monks, court functionaries, clerics. They do not write about ordinary daily life. They write about theology, about laws, about wars, about miracles. Sewage is invisible in the written documentation, the same way it is invisible in daily life. But it appears in unexpected places. In laws that regulate where animals may circulate. In monastic regulations about the construction of latrines. In property records that mention drainage ditches as valued features of a plot of land. In medical texts, derived from the Latin and Arab tradition, that recommend avoiding places with bad smell as a preventive measure against disease. The concern exists. The knowledge of the mechanism does not. What will change this? What will eventually create the path to the modern sanitation system you use today without thinking? It will not be a single discovery. It will not be a moment of revelation. It will be a gradual accumulation over centuries of observations, of failures, of disasters large enough to force structural changes. The late medieval epidemics, the great stink of London in the 19th century, when the Thames became so contaminated that Parliament had to be temporarily closed due to the smell. Pasteur's discovery. The implementation of the first modern sewage systems in European cities in the second half of the 19th century. Each of these steps builds on the previous ones. Each one partially solves the problem the previous one could not solve. But all of this is in the future. A future you will not reach. A future your children will not reach. A future that the children of your children's children may not fully reach. You are in 900 AD, and between where you are and where modern sanitation exists, there is a distance that is not only of time. It is a distance of knowledge, of resources, of social structure, of political priorities, of scientific revolution. So what do? You do what people have always done when they live inside systems they cannot change. You adapt to what cannot be changed. You use what works even without knowing why it works. You observe without explaining. Some villages learn by trial and error, by accident, by superstition that happens to correspond to a biological reality, to keep wells in certain locations, to discard waste in certain places and not others, to not drink from certain sources after certain rains. This knowledge is not science, it is tradition, it is superstition, it is the accumulation of generational experience transformed into cultural practice without understanding the mechanism. And sometimes it works, sometimes it saves lives, sometimes it is the difference between a village that survives and one that does not, because there are villages that do not survive. There are Anglo-Saxon period settlements that simply disappear from the archaeological record, abandoned, sometimes visibly replaced by a new settlement a few kilometers away. Why? There is not always a clear answer. Sometimes it is invasion, sometimes it is soil exhaustion, but sometimes it is disease. Sometimes it is a combination of water contamination, chronic parasitism, and a hard winter that finds a community already so weakened that it cannot recover. And what remains is not a narrative. It is an archaeological silence, a field without a village, a set of artifacts without the bones that use them. You are alive. That is already a victory here. You woke up today, breathed the air laden with the smell you no longer notice, stepped on the floor that holds the biological history of your family, drank the water that carries what you cannot see, and are still standing. This is not trivial. This is the result of an extraordinary adaptation, of an immune system forged under this constant pressure, of a luck that cannot be underestimated. Because beside you, throughout your entire life, people with the same strength, the same diet, the same work, simply stopped, succumbed to what you survived, and you do not know why. They did not know why. Nobody knows why. So when you imagine medieval England, when you imagine the 10th century Anglo-Saxon world, do not imagine only the kings and warriors and battles that books recorded. Imagine the ground. Imagine what is in the ground. Imagine the water that flows from one place to another, carrying what nobody can see. Imagine the children who live and those who do not, and the impossibility of distinguishing why. Imagine the work of carrying water, of digging pits, of dealing with the waste of animals, of surviving in a world where the most constant danger is invisible and omnipresent and completely incomprehensible. Imagine the hands. Imagine what is on those hands. Imagine the meal prepared by those hands and the child who eats from that meal, and the way the same meal that feeds can also kill without anyone ever understanding the connection. This is the world of sewage in England in 900 AD. It is not a system, it is an absence of system. And that absence, that gap between what the human body produces and civilization's capacity to deal with it safely, is perhaps the most deadly thing that has ever existed in human history. More deadly than any war. More deadly than any famine. Silent, constant, democratic in its cruelty, and completely invisible to everyone who lived inside it. If you want to keep exploring worlds like this one, forgotten systems, realities buried under centuries of distance, the physical and biological foundations of civilizations that time has romanticized, then stay. Because the next world we rebuild has its own ways of killing, and they are just as invisible as this one. Tell me in the comments, could you survive knowing that the greatest danger of your life was in the water you drank every day without realizing it? Because the answer is not as simple as it seems.